Good morning, everyone. I'm David Gordon. I am Senior Advisor for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar on After the Election, America and the World. I am joined today by three of my good friends, each of whom I've known for decades. And this is a chat among four friends here today. We hope it will be enlightening. We have Dr. Angela Stent from Georgetown University. We have Dr. Dana Allen, who is the editor of Survival Magazine and an American in London. And we have Tom Wright, who is the head of European Studies at the Brookings Institution. So welcome to each of you. When we first thought up this seminar, talked about when to have it and talked about the title, we knew there was a bit of a risk that the after the election, America and the world, that the after may not quite be right. And of course it isn't. So we are still in the election, although I think there is a growing likelihood that former Vice President Biden is going to eke out a victory in what in the Electoral College has been a very hard fought election. But it looks like his lead in Arizona and Nevada are holding, and that will give him sufficient Electoral College votes independent of the outcome in Pennsylvania that is much less certain. So here we are. We've had this really close election. What might it mean for the rest of the world? And let me start by posing a question connected to the uncertainty of the outcome. So, President Trump has called upon the Supreme Court to stop the vote counting. Of course, he doesn't want that now, because if the vote counting was stopped, he would lose the election at this point. But we're also likely to see a recount in Wisconsin, possibly also in Arizona and Nevada, and other legal action by the president. I don't believe that there's really any stomach in among the Republican Party leadership in the Congress to go down the path of really challenging the outcome if, after all of the recounts and normal legal challenges, the election turns out to be favorable to Vice President Biden. But with President Trump, you never know for sure. So we are in a period of some uncertainty. Let me start off our discussion by asking each of you, are there risks that global actors might try to take advantage of the US? I mean, might Russia try to do something? I know one of the discussions earlier in the year was around the possibility that China might use this to have a major provocation, or perhaps even more vis-a-vis Taiwan. Turkey has been very active on its external accounts in recent weeks in the Eastern Med, in North Africa. Do any of you think any of these could turn into any kind of a short-term crisis. And let me start with Angela, because when you think about short-term crises, Putin is the guy who often does this.
That's true. Well, thank you, David, and I'm delighted to be part of this discussion here. I think that what one should be concerned about is the continuing Russian sort of social media interference in what's going on here. So I think you're likely to see, as long as all these disputes go on here, social media and Russian trolls, whatever, bolstering both the pro-Trump forces, egging them on to, to go and protest, and then also supporting the anti-Trump forces. I think that's going to go on, although I have to say this year there was apparently less Russian interference than there was 4 years ago, and that's partly because I think we in the US have gotten better at defending our systems. In terms of a foreign policy crisis, I mean, if you actually look at what Vladimir Putin is facing, he's not doing so well in his own neighborhood. You've got protests in Russia going on, first of all, in the Far East in Kamchatka. They've been going on for 2 months. They're still going on here. Belarus, Russia's supporting Lukashenko. The protests are going on there. There's a war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Russians have not come to Armenia's defense. They're arguing that they don't have to do that because it's not Armenia proper, even though they have a treaty obligation with the Armenians. So I would say he's pretty preoccupied with what's happening in his own neighborhood, and I would be surprised if there's some major foreign policy move by Russia believing that the US is distracted. So I think what we have to focus on is just making sure that, actors from Russia can't hack and leak and just take advantage of our own polarization right now.
Great. Thanks a lot, Angela. Dana, what about Iran or Turkey?
Well, I mean, I would, I guess I would respond by thinking first about how long this period of uncertainty you're describing is going to last. And, I think that this election does not appear to be this razor edge 2000 Gore versus Bush type election that will be, how to put it, empirically disputed. Now, that could be a real crisis for the United States. And in the case of adversaries like Iran, it would be a particular boon. If we don't expect that, then we have to look at, what President Trump decides to do in terms of transition and handover, which could continue to be very unorthodox. Let's put it that way. Does he concede? Do we have, at least a sort of formal doubt about his willingness to do that? But if, as seems to be expected, in the next 48 hours, it's pretty clear that Vice President Biden has unequivocally won, then I think the crisis of American legitimacy will be less acute and more long-term. And I think we'll probably get into that. If there was a crisis in the Middle East involving aggressive action by Iran, that could be, that could be problematic at a time when the United States is distracted. But frankly, the United States is always distracted these days. So I'm not sure we're really looking at this immediate circumstance. The question about Turkey, I think, is very interesting because it segues into our broader question about the unity of the alliance, the ability of other European allies to run a coherent and to some extent autonomous foreign policy vis-a-vis a lot of problems, including their disputes with their own NATO ally, Turkey. So, that's something that, I don't know particularly what, this gets more to the coherence of NATO and NATO Europe, which I think is going to be a long-term question, which I think we might get to later.
Yes, absolutely. Tom, what about China?
Yeah, so, I think, David, and it's great to see everyone, and thanks so much for having me. To push back a little bit, I think on the assumption, I guess, underpinning this. I mean, if you look at what people were worried about before the election and what's happened since, I think most of the worst case scenarios have not come to pass, right? We always knew that Trump would say the election was being stolen, that he would declare victory in the night. That was very clear. No Republicans have gone along with him in doing that, certainly none of any significance. It does look like we'll have a clear outcome, right? There is the voting, the counting is continuing uninterrupted. There are some protesters out there on cable news, but they're not all that significant. There's no protests on the streets. The day of the election, Washington, D.C. was completely shut down to traffic. If there was a real sense of anxiety, there's none of that, right? So I don't sort of see this as a crisis or as a moment of upheaval or that American democracy is sort of being questioned. It actually seems to be running very smoothly, right? As smoothly as any of us could have hoped for, given the personality of the president, right? So if you set him aside, everything else I think is working pretty normally. So to your question then about will they take advantage of this interregnum, of the moment when Trump has lost but is still president, I think in general, no, for one overarching reason, which is anything that Iran or China or Russia were to do would basically tilt the deck in terms of what Biden's foreign policy would be like, right? So if the Chinese want to have a Biden team that is, a little less hawkish than the Trump team, I think the Republican Senate is not good news for them in that. Like, that divided government may unify around a toughen China theme. But the worst thing they could possibly do would be to confirm all priors, do something aggressive, and then end up with a national consensus going into January that they're the major problem. And the same, I think, goes for others as well. So, my base case, look, anything can happen and you never know what's going on in the minds of some of these leaders, and it's highly personalized. But I expect we'll actually have a relatively, uneventful couple of months in terms of the intentional actions of adversaries. I might be wrong about that, but that would be my base case.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing? I think
sure. Absolutely.
I think Tom is absolutely right, and this does not feel, as I think I mentioned, like the crisis of succession that many of us, some of us were worried about. The one thing I would add to that, or the one qualification is, and Tom, you can tell me if you disagree with this, but I think part of your premise is we tend to discount what Donald Trump says. In other words, he's denying that he's coming up with rather outlandish views about the illegitimacy of the election, and we sort of discount that as noise. It's possible that from abroad, this might be taken more seriously than it is in the United States. That's just one point.
That's a good point, Dana. One we need to keep in mind. Dana, let's talk a little bit about Europe. So certainly Western Europe, that set of countries, if you're looking around the world at different regions and hopes and expectations for the election, Europe was the easiest call. That the Europeans clearly had this very strong preference for a Biden victory. So what's been the response in Europe to this somewhat uncertain outcome, and to the fact that Biden looks like he's winning, but it also looks at the same time that 2016 wasn't necessarily this huge anomaly. So what's been the response in Europe to this sort of two-sided election result here?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of this is speculation because obviously it's only been 48 hours.
Right.
First of all, the premise of your question is absolutely correct. It's America's European allies, with the arguable slight exception of Britain, although I'd say that's only a slight exception, that, like many, let's say, centrist and liberal Americans, were, hoping for a massive repudiation of Trumpism. And that has not happened, apparently, although, we do need to think back to the 2018 congressional elections, the midterm elections, where after because of the so-called blue shift, it may look more decisive in a few weeks than it looks right now. But yes, it certainly looks like the Senate will remain in Republican hands. And yeah, it was a close election. There were polling errors that went in President Trump's direction. So that's not entirely reassuring to those European allies who were hoping for a decisive repudiation. And of course, the first thing to say is that, as you said in your question, our European allies have to take very seriously the prospect that this is not an aberration, that a Trumpist figure could come back in 4 years, that even President Trump could run for election in 4 years. The first 4 years of Trump were, I think, a period where Western Europe, in particular, was starting to think seriously about how they needed to hedge against American unreliability. And that hedging doesn't end at this point. You hear, for example, somewhat semantic discussions and debates going on in Europe about European strategic autonomy and whether that is something to strive for. And the German defense minister gave a speech in which she said that she seemed to say, no, we don't want to talk about this concept of autonomy. We need the United States, and we shouldn't imagine our strategic future without the United States. But that's going to continue to be a muddled argument. And I think, by the way, I think that definition of autonomy is a misunderstanding of what is actually needed, which is a Europe that, to a certain extent, diplomatically, can carry its own weight, but also militarily.
Thank you. Angela, President Putin certainly appears that he had hoped for the opposite outcome of the European leaders, despite this interesting statement he made last week about the Trump family not having done anything wrong in Ukraine. So what's your sense about what the thinking is in Moscow right now?
So I think, on the one hand, many of the political class and presumably President Putin himself wanted Donald Trump to win. And they certainly wanted him to win in 2016. On the other hand, they were beginning to realize, and they realized some time ago, he hasn't been able to deliver, right? He promised them 4 years ago they'd make a deal, they'd have a much better relationship. He hinted that, maybe Ukraine really should be in Russia's sphere of influence, and he criticized sanctions. Well, because of what happened in 2016, and because of the congressional reaction to that with all of the sanctions, he just was not able to deliver. So they started to look upon him as someone who was really unpredictable. And so you saw them in recent weeks kind of hedging their bets. Certainly, President Putin, in his Valdai speech last week, said, he would work with either candidate. And then this very curious and interesting statement he made about the Biden family, or Hunter Biden's business dealings, and that there was nothing wrong with them. And then getting irritated when people talked about possible links between Yelena Baturina, the widow of the late Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov, doing business with a firm that Hunter Biden was involved with. So I think at this point, if you look at the official Russian media, they are making fun of us. They're saying that we're a superpower in not only in decline but fading fast. You obviously had former Mayor Giuliani appearing for half an hour on election day on RT, the Kremlin's propaganda channel, again railing about Hunter Biden and other things. But I think they're now, I mean, on the one hand, I think the chaos that they see here gives them pleasure because, again, they can say, is this democracy? Is this what you want? We have a stable, predictable system. On the other hand, there are certain things that they really do want. And one of them is that they really do want to renew the New START agreement, the strategic arms agreement that expires on February 5th next year. And the Trump administration very belatedly started negotiating with them, but so far nothing has come of it. And I think that's something where they look to the Biden team and they realize this is something that they could get from the Biden team. So I think at this point, they're obviously waiting to see what happens. But I think they're now also beginning to realize, and I think you see that in some of the comments, that a Biden administration would restore diplomacy, that the State Department would once again become a more professional organization and not so politicized. And the Russians, particularly the Russians in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and places like that, they prefer to deal with what they would view as kind of traditional, normal American diplomacy.
Those are very interesting comments, and we'll return to some of these themes. Tom Wright, for those of you who don't know, spends a lot of his time thinking about U.S.-China relations and U.S. policy towards China. Tom, who do you think that President Xi hoped would win this election? There's been a debate both in this country and a little bit of a debate in China on what China's preferences are, and how do you think China's reacting to this outcome?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I'll come in a minute as well on Dana's comment too, because I just wanted to just on the European
yes,
reaction.
please.
I mean, we can't know, I think, what she thought is, the two sides of the argument where he liked the chaos of Trump and he liked the fact that the US was being hollowed out and that the domestic piece was becoming ever more divisive and the US was turning inward. And that's sort of my view. My view is that he, there was part of the Trump administration's policy to China that obviously he didn't like because it was quite tough on China in many respects, but that was outweighed by those larger sort of macro trends. So I think he will be disappointed in that regard, but I think it's a bigger thing too, though, because if you look at the Republican Senate, and I think it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to pick up those runoff seats if there are 2 runoff seats in January, because the Republicans can make the argument, you don't have to vote for Trump, just vote for us to be a check on the Democrats. And that's always a persuasive message for whoever makes it in terms of being a check on power. So let's assume there's a Republican Senate. The one thing that the Republican Senate and important elements in the Biden administration would agree on is China, right? And you may see key appointments and key policies, an emphasis being placed on the competition with China as sort of a unifying theme. And that could even extend to domestic policy also, in terms of infrastructure and spending on those key areas. So I think in that sense, he could be facing the formation of a national consensus on China, actually, that will, I think, be good for the United States and not so good for the CCP. The point I wanted to make on Dana's comment, which I very much agree with in terms of the European reaction, and there hasn't been a full-scale repudiation of Trumpism and hedging. I have a slightly different spin on it, in that I think that the Biden administration, if he does win, should actually embrace a lot of that and say, look, the question is, how do we use these 4 years that we have to shockproof the international order against the return of America first, whether it's Trump or someone else? And so how do we build redundancy in? So if Trump comes back and pulls out of NATO, let's say, that is less damaging than it would be if it happened right now. And if you look at the strategic autonomy debate, it's been sort of an article of faith in that there can't be duplication between the EU and NATO, right? So EU security shouldn't duplicate NATO because that would be a bad thing. But maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe actually having some redundancy in the system would actually mean that there was multiple pillars, you know. So I think shock-proofing the sort of system of cooperation and alliances ought to be an active organizing principle of the Biden administration in cooperation with Europe or with others over the next few years.
Thank you.
I mean, just to add to that,
Please.
The one thing that is clear, I mean, Tom knows better than I do whether, you know, a Biden team would actually embrace the things that former Democratic administrations were kind of wary of, including duplication and so forth. But one thing that's very clear and a huge difference is that this administration will be positive towards the European Union and most of what the European Union tries to do. And if, to the extent that that is a degree of self-sufficiency in defense, that will be, I think, something Biden would promote.
So, Dana, I have a follow-on to that. So I completely agree that relations with Europe under a Biden administration will be of a really different tenor. On the other hand, it's sometimes the case that Europe's leaders have unrealistic expectations, particularly on issues like attitude to climate change. And I think that Tom's point about the likely continuation of the Republican domination of the Senate it will be something very important, and Biden's going to have to make some big compromises, and certainly any notion of a Green New Deal are off the agenda now, given the likely status of the Senate. So what's your sense, being in Europe but keeping a close watch on the U.S. on where might the areas of expectations running ahead of reality be?
Well, I think you identified probably the most important one, which is, you know, Biden will the United States yesterday, I believe, left
Right.
the climate agreement officially.
Right.
And it will rejoin it.
Absolutely.
So America will be, again, at least for 4 years, rhetorically committed to global cooperation to deal with, you know, what I think Vice President Biden genuinely sees as the number one issue, or at least one of the top 3 issues, and an existential issue facing the United States. So this will be very much, this will be music to European ears. However, you're right that, you know, an American strategy that involves spending a lot of money in the trillions of dollars is going to have is probably not going to be possible now because of Republican control of the Senate. So in a way, I think this supports Tom's earlier point, which is that part of the discussion has to be how can Europe is so gung-ho on dealing with this problem. How can it take?
Yeah, what are you going to do about it?
More of the leadership. I mean, that's one area. You know, I would, in a certain sense, this is never, you know, there's always a tendency to quarrel with the premise of the question, but it's probably true that there are very high expectations among, you know, European publics, in particular for the end of Trumpism. But, you know, I'm also struck by what I think is a sort of opposite view, which is almost, I believe is mistaken. There are a lot of European leaders who make a strong argument for continuity. And they say that, you know, in other words, the Trump attacks on NATO are a continuation of long-term American complaints about burden sharing, or the Trump announcement of withdrawal from Syria was just like Obama on the red line. And I think that's a false continuity. I actually think that the principles, the values, the commitment to liberal order that you saw in an Obama administration, which you will continue to see, you will again see in a Biden administration, are just in a different planet from the attitudes of a Trump administration. So I actually think this is one place where they may be pleasantly surprised as opposed to disappointed, if you see what I mean.
Interesting. Angela, so what approaches is a Biden administration likely to take with Russia?
So I think the number one item on the to-do list after inauguration would, because they'll have 2 weeks, would be to extend the New START agreement.
Yeah.
And that should hopefully not be difficult. I think they might extend it for 5 years, and then they will start negotiating with Russia for what a follow-on agreement might look like. And obviously, it has to be one that takes into account, more modern systems, cyber, and all the developments that have happened in the past, since the New START agreement was ratified in 2011. And Putin has also interestingly made some comments about not going back to the Intermediate Range Force Agreement, INF agreement, but finding new ways of verifying what's happening. Because I think really the Russians, despite some of the rhetoric there, they don't want to have to go into a full-fledged arms race, either with strategic weapons or intermediate range weapons. So I think the arms control part of it, I think, would be there on day one, just because the clock is running out and they do have to extend it. On the issue of Chinese weapons, which of course was the reason the Trump administration gave why they didn't want to just extend New START, I think there's a recognition that eventually that does have to become part of the conversation, but that's further down the road. Now, on the other hand, I think the Biden administration would clearly be upfront about wanting to deal with Russia on these issues of Russian interference and where to go from here. And so I think they would take a tougher stance. I don't know how that will all develop. Obviously, the Russians have offered several times at the beginning of the Trump administration to sit down and have discussions with the United States about a non-interference pact. That's viewed very skeptically among a lot of people in this country. But, there are issues that will certainly have to be dealt with. There will also, I think, be a review of the sanctions regime. That doesn't mean they're going to be modified, but I think there's a recognition that the sanctions have to be re-examined to see how efficacious and productive they've been. And obviously, they haven't done much to change the situation in Ukraine. But if the Senate stays in Republican hands, and actually, even if it doesn't, you had 99 out of 100 senators voting to impose a lot of the sanctions a few years ago. So there might not be that much of a modification. I think a difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration has to do with democracy promotion and human rights. Obviously, this has not been a priority for the Trump administration. I think it would be more of a priority for the Biden administration, and that could be obviously more problematic with the Russians. But I do think there are other areas my colleagues have already talked about, and you've talked about climate change. This is an issue now where Russia is waking up more. I mean, a few years ago, Putin said there's nothing wrong if it's 2 degrees warmer in Russia. At the Valdai Club a couple of weeks ago, he said this is a very serious problem. We have to take this seriously. This is an area potentially where there could be the U.S. could work with Russia, and also on the global pandemic. I think there might be a different attitude than a Biden administration toward cooperating with other countries and trying to deal with all of this. So I think that's my way of saying that And then to come back to what I said before, I think restoring normal channels. If you look at what's happened during the Trump administration, the number of contacts at a high level between the US and Russia were really quite minimized. Strategic stability talks did take place, but there were only a few of them. So I think restoring just kind of the normal diplomatic channels of engagement with Russia would be a priority. So I think you would see a different policy. And having said that, my final comment on this is, on the other hand, there is less variation in policy toward Russia between Democratic and Republican administrations, because the issues, as you well know, don't go away. I think the difference is we had a bifurcated policy toward Russia in this Trump administration, with the president pursuing really a completely different policy than the rest, or wanting to pursue aspirationally than the rest of the executive branch and the Congress. And I think that would not be the case in a Biden administration.
Speaking of continuities, Tom, you mentioned that U.S. Policy to China is going to be marked by a lot of continuity. So can you drill down a little bit more on some of the specifics of the continuities, and more particularly, how might a Biden administration be different in terms of its China policy?
Yeah, so, I think that if you look at sort of where Biden world is, there's a variety of different views within it, particularly on China. And there's one school of thought, I think, that would say we need to compete with China, stand up for our interests, protect the allies, do all of that. But we also need sort of a strong bilateral relationship. Some of this great power competition stuff has gotten out of whack. There has to be a recalibration of that, focus on these transnational issues and other things. And then the other camp would, I think, have a liberal version of great power competition, right? A more liberal version of what Trump has had, differing on some key points. The fact that we're looking at divided government, I think, does, tilt it in favor of that second group. I think because, for one thing, on the nomination side, I think this will be a key question that Republicans have if they control the nomination process. And you could see just on how you move legislation, on the domestic side, as I was sort of mentioning earlier, Republicans are probably going to be opposed to anything that sort of spends money. They'll find their deficit concerns again, and they'll have no qualms really about trying to impede Biden's domestic agenda, except for maybe some emergency stimulus on COVID at a pretty small level. But the one big exception to that is you are seeing shifts in the Republican caucus, on the domestic implications of competition with China. So more supportive of industrial policy, which they never would have been supportive of before, more supportive of on the regulatory side on tech and other issues. So I think that is sort of a potential area for cooperation. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was sort of carved out as the bridge between the White House and the Senate. Now, in terms of the differences, there were significant differences with Trump, but interestingly, these are differences that the Republicans in the Senate also have with Trump, right? So, Trump doesn't care about Xinjiang. He doesn't really care about Hong Kong. He doesn't care about human rights. He doesn't care about the values piece. And he doesn't really care about the geopolitical piece in its own right in terms of the US alliances in the region. That was always going to be a big difference between a Biden China policy and a Trump China policy. But on that, the Republicans in the Senate are fully on board with most of that, right? In that they also have problems with Trump on that score. They've just been somewhat silent about it. Or they've quietly worked it on the legislative side and sanctions in Hong Kong and the like. So I think there will be differences. I think one of the areas of difference between Republicans in general and Democrats is on the multilateralism piece and on the broader agenda, and the need to cooperate with China in certain areas. So, including on climate. So that will be an issue, I think. But I think a lot of that is sort of manageable, actually.
Excellent. Okay. So I know that there are a lot of questions that have been bubbling up from the floor. So with these introductory comments, let me now move to the second part of our program. If you have a question, you should click on the participants list at the bottom of your screen, and then raise your hand, and you will go into the queue, and we will be able to identify you in that manner. I have several people who've written Q&A out in the Q&A button. Let me see if we can turn first to Stephen Whittaker. Can we put Stephen Whittaker's mic on, please? If we can, Stephen, if you could hit your participant and hand wave, that will get you on. Excellent. Over to you, Stephen.
All right, well, thank you very much for taking my question. I know we covered a portion of this a bit earlier on in the talk, but I wanted to ask if the election results remain on their current track, we're expecting to see a near split, if not an outright Republican-controlled Senate, as we've been discussing a little bit. And I'm wondering how much this is going to hamstring a Biden administration's foreign policy, and will it impact a certain flavor on the administration's priorities, including China, as well as, perhaps working with European allies as well?
Excellent. And if I could just add something to that, could I ask each of the individuals to at least consider the question of climate here, because climate, along with China and alliances, were the three big foreign policy themes that Vice President Biden campaigned on. So, Dana, would you like to take this first?
All right, sure. I've already spoken about climate and the way that this is going to likely to limit a Biden administration. I mean, my general view is that the problem with divided control of the government is going to be is not going to be directly over. I mean, maybe my co-panelists will come up with some places where I'm wrong on this, but I think it's not going to be a direct hindrance to any particular foreign policy so much as it's going to be a huge distraction and a problem for a Biden administration's bandwidth. Let's, as I think Angela, reminded us, we're having this transition, if the transition comes, at a time of public health crisis, when it's probably going to be worse in January, when there's going to be a question of, a likelihood with Republican control of the Senate of inadequate fiscal response to that crisis. And that's just going to inherently hobble American leadership, because the administration is going to be distracted. It's going to be dealing with major crises, and it's going to be, less able to have a strategic foreign policy, if I can put it that way. The one question on a specific foreign policy area or a national security policy, I suppose, comes to the intention to re-engage Iran and rejoin the JCPOA, and offer or be able to have a negotiating position with Iran, which might, I could see ways in which Republican control of the Senate could interfere with that, although it was going to be difficult to remove American sanctions anyway. So. But you know, I would emphasize just this general problem of American dysfunction, American domestic dysfunction, that I think is going to hobble its foreign policy.
Angela.
I don't have too much to add.
Congress has been a big actor on Russia policy for a long time, getting ahead of almost every administration.
Right. I don't really have too much to add to what Dana said. I mean, I think we have to remember that having a Republican-controlled Senate will affect cabinet choices. So it will probably mean that it will be much harder for a Biden administration to put more progressive left-wing people in cabinet positions because they might not get through the Senate. And it may be more likely that people who are senators will have an easier time of getting cabinet posts just because of the way things are run. So Congress has been a very important actor during this Trump administration, in fact, in acting as a brake on President Trump's desire to improve ties to Russia. And so I don't really see that changing. As I said, the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate had a consensus about sanctions, and I don't see any of that changing. I agree with Dana. I think the Biden administration would like to rejoin the JCPOA and find some way of interacting with Iran. But I think that's going to be, that's going to be difficult. And this is, of course, something that the Russians would welcome, by the way. But I think that is going to be difficult with the composition of the Senate. So I don't see a Republican Senate having a huge impact on a Biden administration's ability to do what it wants in terms of relationship with Russia, beyond agreeing with Dana that the general dysfunction of the United States system going forward, will certainly act as a brake on some of these things.
Tom, I know you spend a lot of time looking at executive legislative interaction in the U.S. What's your response to Stephen Whittaker's question?
Yeah, without repeating, because I know I spoke on this earlier, without repeating the stuff on China, just a few additional observations that might be a little more granular. Like the first is, this would be a fairly unique situation, right? So by my count, there hasn't been a first-term president that didn't have the Senate since 1988, and then it was a different Senate, right? It was a Senate that, the Democrats had the Senate for decades, and it functioned sort of differently. And Democrats, of course, had a division internally with Southern senators and who tended to be more conservative. So I think that this is a unique problem that Biden will have, and it particularly pertains to the nomination process initially, right? Second point is that I think it's hugely complicating for the transition, right? This is unfolding in real time, but it looks like there'll be two runoffs in Georgia because it looks like Purdue is just going to be underneath the 50% threshold to win a seat. So on January 5th, there'll be two special elections to determine control. Now, if you're the Biden team, you would have wanted to roll out all your appointments, senior appointments early, right? And to have a plan for what you would do in the first few weeks and to sketch out the legislative agenda. I think all of that is basically frozen, right? I mean, who they even announce for these positions will be determined by those runoffs. So, I think it may I know this won't necessarily matter in the long term, but in terms of just living the next 2 or 3 months, I think it will cast a big shadow over the preparations for the first 6 months. And then the final point, David, is just on climate, and on Dana's comments earlier. There has been a bit of a discussion amongst some climate experts in the Democratic community about the risk that anything they do on the legislative side can be reversed at a later point, right? So there's sort of two camps. One camp says, we need to go big, quickly put in place this legislation, re-engage with the international community. And the other group says, that's all great, and we agree with that, but all of that is very tenuous because it can be reversed the minute Republicans take back control. So what we need to do is to work at the state and city level to lock in those gains, to put a real federal push into that state and city level carbon emission reductions so it's more durable. I think that this divided government will strengthen that second group, right? It will mean that Biden will have to say to the world, we are going to make progress, but we're not going to do it legislatively. We're going to do it sort of locally. But the sort of the silver lining to that cloud is that if they can figure that out, that is a more durable strategy, right? That strategy actually is more shockproofed against a return of climate skeptics. So it's a very mixed picture, I think, but it's not all negative. Like, there are significant gains that could be made and could endure if there is by necessity a focus on that state and city, particularly the city level.
One last comment. I'll throw in my 2 cents prerogative of the chair. I think the likelihood of the Senate being controlled by Republicans increases the chance that a President Biden would appoint Senator Chris Coons as Secretary of State. I think he's been on the list already, but I think that in terms of getting a key appointment through the Senate, that's going to look pretty attractive to a President Biden, particularly if the Republicans do indeed retain control of the Senate. Let me move to Johan Ireland. Johan, can we get his microphone on, Tom?
Sorry, David, he's not responding at the moment.
Okay. Let me go to Mohammed Siraj Khan. Mohammed? No? Okay. Let's try Cho Kong.
Sorry, David, that attendee left.
Okay. So Cho Kong had the question, and it's a good one. We've talked about the prospects for the U.S. rejoining JCPOA and some of the challenges there. What about the prospects of a Biden administration rejoining the TPP, which is now the CPTPP, as part of a strategy of restoring a stronger U.S. position in East Asia? I know that President Biden has sort of indicated that he doesn't really want to go that route, but might he be pulled in that direction? Tom?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that Biden definitely did not want to start out with big multilaterals. And I think they were looking at a series of more focused agreements around China, dealing with sort of larger issues on the global economy. I think they would have replaced TTIP with that. I think on the Asia side, I think, the old frame is a little more compatible with that view, but I think they wouldn't have gone to TPP initially. I do wonder if that changes with the Senate piece. It becomes more potentially of an option within the next 2 years, maybe not immediately, but maybe a little later on. But I still tend to think that they won't go that route. I think they will want to demonstrate that foreign economic policy has changed and is dealing with a different set of issues that pertain to people's lives, right, in a way that they really feel that it's impacting them. And so they'll want sort of a soft, progressive, nationalist approach, not protectionist, but one that makes the closer connection to the middle classes, as the campaign spoke about repeatedly.
Dana, what about prospects for a U.S.-UK trade deal? What's your sense?
Well, you know, there's been, of course, a lot of anxiety in the Johnson government about this aspect of the Biden administration, not least because the Democrats in Congress and Joe Biden himself did lay down the gauntlet on saying that anything that damaged the Good Friday Agreement, any form of Brexit that damaged the Good Friday Agreement would render a U.S.-UK trade deal impossible. You know, I mean, the first thing I want to say about that is that it's possible that my colleagues on the panel may know more about, you know, these trade issues than I do. But this has always been something of a UK delusion, as though a trade deal with the United States, even in a second Trump term, would be easy to negotiate, or even if it could be negotiated, would be more than a drop in the bucket compared to the economic damage that Brexit is going to do. So, you know, I mean, speaking as I am from London, I just think that, you know, whatever happens with US-UK trade relations, it's not going to be very consequential. But it's also the case that that these deals are difficult. I don't think they would be a priority of the Biden administration. There's a residue of anger or resentment towards the Johnson government in terms of in terms of statements that were made during the Obama administration. But I don't really think that's particularly important. I just don't think it's going to be a huge American priority, and I don't think it's going to be that easy to negotiate. So it's not the solution to Britain's manifest problems.
So let me ask a bit of a follow-up here on the sanctions issue. So sanctions have been a foreign policy tool of choice, certainly at least in the last two administrations. Are we heading in a Biden term for continuity on the utilization of sanctions, or might Biden step back from the use of sanctions as a go-to foreign policy tool, given that it's less than the use of military force, but it's more than just a statement, and it can be a relatively effective, in some circumstances, use of U.S. economic leverage. Angela, this is going to come up on Nord Stream.
Sure. So, you know, first of all, the U.S. it's not just the past two administrations. I mean, the U.S. tends to use sanctions just because it has that kind of power to do it. You're talking about sanctions against the Soviet and Russian energy industry. I can take you back to the Kennedy era when that administration tried to prevent the construction of the oil friendship pipeline from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe. So, and of course, each time it doesn't work, they tried it in the Reagan administration. But sanctions is, you know, the fallback position whenever, at least in the case of Russia, it does something that the US doesn't like sanctioning. So now you have these Nordstrom sanctions, which essentially are by now sanctions against our allies, the Germans and the other Europeans who were involved in the construction of this pipeline. It's nearly completed, but it's very hard for the Russians with their own ships to complete the last part of it. And so this is what the Senate has now increasingly sanctioned. I would say there's really a bipartisan consensus on this. Even though people in the Biden campaign have certainly said we should review, are these smart sanctions in general? We should review sanctions. How efficacious have they been? But there are a number of people who've been working on this who did work in the Obama administration in imposing the sanctions. So I see very little likelihood that this is going to change in a Biden administration. The Nord Stream issue, again, I think there's bipartisan consensus that the Nord Stream pipeline shouldn't be constructed, even though this has obviously caused us problems, particularly with the Germans. And, you can argue that even if it's not completed, the Europeans are still going to get their gas from Russia, the lion's share of it, but just via different pipelines. And they've taken some measures to make sure that they wouldn't be vulnerable to it. But I don't see much of a change there, because you always come back to the question, if you say, well, these sanctions aren't working, and they're not changing Russian behavior, and Europeans have been dealing with Russian gas, for decades, for at least 4 decades. Then the question is, as you yourself raised, what's the alternative? Yeah. If you're not going to respond militarily to things that Russia has done, then sanctions are the next best alternative. But I think the problem is when the US then lands up sanctioning its allies and causing more problems than it needs to.
Tom, views on the sanctions issue more generally?
Yeah, more generally, I think what you saw, in the last 4 years was, in a lot of ways, Congress proposed these sanctions, especially on Russia, because they were so deeply frustrated with Trump that they weren't willing to sort of listen to the concerns that many people had, including sort of hawks or European allies on sort of the effects of these sanctions or some of the unintended consequences, right? And so it was a sense that, we have to do something. The Trump administration isn't playing ball, so we're going to make them do this. I think at the very least, there'll be sort of a pause for thought on trying to figure out all of the different dimensions of a sanctions strategy. And there's a lot of people, I think, who will go into a Biden administration who've done a lot of thinking on that. There's dozens of reports and studies now on sanctions in an interdependent world and all of the different sort of versions and options. So I guess I don't know where they'll come down in it, but my hope would be that we do have an opportunity for sort of a sort of strategic look at the effects and when they can be employed most effectively. I think, David, the other point is just what will happen with all the sanctions that are in place already.
Yes.
And I think what's the outcome of the election, I think, makes it more likely that will be, and I think that's probably what happened anyway, that those sanctions will be seen as leverage and that they won't be given up without getting something big in return, right? So whether it's Iran or China or Russia, I think that there won't be a full reset. I think there will be a sense that, these are bargaining chips, and the Biden administration will be in a fairly good position on some of its diplomatic negotiations.
Dana, let me turn to you and ask you about Turkey a little bit. So Turkey has become an increasing challenge for European countries, as well as for the US, but it's sort of closer to Europe, so it's more of an issue here. But as I look at sort of individual relationships where I think the Biden administration is probably going to want to take a somewhat different stance than the Trump administration, Turkey is one of those issues. So what are the lessons from Europe's relationship and challenges in dealing with Turkey that a new administration should be thinking about?
That's an incredibly difficult question. And, I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to I mean, it's an inherently fraught relationship right now. Obviously, alliance relations with Turkey were always fraught because of the fact that both Greece and Turkey were in NATO. I mean, that's
right.
So there's American muscle memory for dealing with that problem. But the contentiousness and the behavior of Erdogan in recent years, the turn towards authoritarianism, the purchase and deployment of Russian air defense, all of these things, have led at least outspoken European allies such as President Macron to say, is Turkey, I mean, I don't know if he said it in exactly these terms, but, is Turkey really an ally, a NATO ally? I mean, I would look for an acronym like RHINO, but I'm not sure what it would be. Now, perhaps from a somewhat more detached American perspective, since we have this kind of muscle memory of trying to bridge these problems within Europe, maybe there is scope for a Biden administration to try to, repair NATO relations vis-a-vis Turkey. But it's a very difficult problem because, as I think Angela mentioned, there will be at least a greater rhetorical commitment on the Biden administration to democracy issues.
Right.
I mean, you can look at, I don't know if Saudi Arabia is a perfect analogy but Biden as a candidate was very outspoken about human rights issues in vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. So I'd actually be interested in what, it's a difficult problem. I don't know. I suspect my co-panelists might have something wiser to say than I do.
Yeah. Angela, any comments on Turkey? Of course, Turkey-Russia is an important relationship, but also, are there any geopolitical areas outside of the nuclear realm where you think there could be fruitful engagement, Syria or Ukraine or any of these other issues, even Armenia, Azerbaijan on NK?
Sure. So I think on Ukraine, let's start with that. I mean, essentially, since all the events leading up to the impeachment of President Trump, we no longer have a special envoy from the United States who's been dealing with Ukraine. I mean, we obviously have people at the State Department who are, and Deputy Secretary of State Beacon has to some extent, but we don't anymore have someone who regularly goes there. So I think one thing that the Biden administration, they're committed obviously to supporting Ukraine, and I think they would revive diplomacy. They would surely reappoint a person whose main job it is to try and deal with these issues. Not that they're easy to deal with.
Yeah.
So I think that will become more of a priority. It's just really atrophied because the atmosphere around it was so poisoned by everything, again, that led up to the impeachment, and then by all the noise about Hunter Biden. So I think that's something that would change. In the Middle East, I mean, Syria is still a big problem. Clearly, just a couple of years ago, and this is in the Trump administration, U.S. and their allied troops were involved in Syria with a battle, right, with the Wagner, the Russian mercenaries, where at least 200 people were killed. So we've had real issues with Russia in Syria. Russia, by the way, now is increasingly having a confrontational relationship with Turkey in Syria and with what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh. No doubt, we could sit down and try and revive diplomacy. I mean, the civil war is grinding on there. And there are other areas, I think, where a Biden administration will focus more. I think it might focus more on the Middle East. So there are some areas where we maybe could engage with the Russians more, but also where we have very different interests.
Thank you. Tom, I'm going to call on you for final comment here. What about the potential for a Biden administration seriously looking to transform the G7 into a D10?
Yeah, David, and I know this is an issue you've pioneered and done a huge amount of work on. I think its moment may have come. I think there is scope for that. I think it's one area you would see broad support, I think, across the aisle. So from Republicans in the Senate, if they do have the Senate, not that they would need to ratify it or anything. Biden, of course, has had this idea about greater cooperation amongst democracies. I think the question is how and when would it happen? It's a few different pathways. I think one is that Biden could ask Boris Johnson very early on to hold an emergency virtual summit of the G7 on COVID and on the pandemic response, and that would be a G7 +3. So to add South Korea, India, Australia, maybe one or two others, and that then will be the D10, except it will be the G10. A slightly different way to go about it will be to keep the G7 the way it is and have a D10 focus on technology issues and on sort of responding to China. But I think that is likely to happen, I think, in the first year. And it's a way of sort of locking it in without sort of overly institutionalizing it, without having a League of Democracies or very massive new democracy summit like the Nuclear Security Summit.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers for a really interesting panel. Great questions from the floor. We'll all be watching both the outcome of the election, certainly, what happens during the period of transition, and how a President Biden grapples with what's a perennial issue for new U.S. presidents, and that is that they inherit a world that has all these givens, and that the world they inherit is not an easy one to transform into the world as they would like it to be. So we will again be watching that, should, as it looks like now, former Vice President Biden emerge as the next president of the United States. I want to thank my IISS colleagues, Amy and Tom, for their support, and for all of you for attending today's session. We will be going back to this issue certainly very early in the new year with another webinar at that time. So thanks to everybody. And with that, I call this session to a close.